The Soviet Union's fantastic aircraft-carrying cruisers were an incredible paradox. They were simultaneously a symbol of glory and a harbinger of the disappearance of a great naval power. Imagine a world gripped by anxiety, frozen in tense anticipation. Western intelligence agencies were baffled by the rumors, and NATO military analysts couldn't believe their eyes. American newspapers were filled with sensational headlines, reporting that the Soviet Union had created something completely new, something formidable and defying classification. At the height of the Cold War, ships unlike any the world had seen rose high in the slipways of Soviet shipyards. These were not just aircraft carriers, nor were they ordinary missile cruisers. They were a monstrous hybrid, combining the might of an air wing with the unprecedented firepower of offensive missiles. The world was accustomed to viewing aircraft carriers as an exclusive symbol of American military might. However, when the Soviet Union laid down its first aircraft-carrying cruisers, it became clear that the rules of naval warfare were changing before our very eyes. The Soviet press remained silent. Officials evaded direct answers, and photographs taken by reconnaissance satellites caused genuine shock among military experts. What was this project? Why did Moscow need such an unusual vessel? Why did a ship, which was supposed to represent global superiority, combine the functions of two different classes at once? These questions tormented not only the offices of Western admirals, but also the minds of ordinary people closely following the arms race. It seemed the Soviet Union was preparing to make an incredible leap that could completely shift the balance of power on the world's oceans. Yet, behind the facade of might lay a different, more complex truth. Soviet aircraft-carrying cruisers were born from paradoxes and compromises. They were intended to serve simultaneously as a shield and a sword, as well as a political statement that the Soviet Union could project power anywhere on the globe. Their emergence symbolized ambition and determination, but also sowed the seeds of future problems. The idea of creating a unique vessel combining the functions of an aircraft carrier and a heavy missile cruiser was not accidental in the Soviet Union. It all began in the 1960s, when Cold War tension peaked and the world's oceans became an arena of constant confrontation between the fleets of the United States and the USSR. For decades, the Americans had relied on classic aircraft carriers, massive floating airfields capable of projecting power anywhere. The Soviet Union lacked such ships, which was considered a serious strategic deficiency. However, Moscow was in no hurry to copy the American experience for several reasons. Firstly, ideological considerations. The Soviet Union viewed carriers as tools of aggression and symbols of capitalist expansion. Secondly, the economic factor. Building a ship with a displacement of hundreds of thousands of tons, like those in the United States, was prohibitively expensive, even for a superpower. But the most crucial factor was strategy. The Soviet Union did not intend to fight by the same rules as the United States. Instead, the Kremlin decided to pursue an asymmetric response, creating a type of ship that would disrupt the conventional logic of naval warfare. The idea of anti-submarine cruisers emerged first. These ships were supposed to hunt down U.S. nuclear submarines, which, with ballistic missiles on board, posed a mortal threat. However, it soon became clear that anti-submarine capabilities alone were insufficient. The Soviet Navy needed a ship capable of both covering its own formations in the open ocean and launching retaliatory strikes against enemy carrier groups. It was then that a daring idea arose within the General Staff and the Ministry of Defense to combine two forces in one hull, the power of aviation and the lethality of heavy missiles. However, implementing this concept sparked heated debate among the military. Some demanded a full-fledged aircraft carrier capable of accommodating conventional planes, while others insisted on a cruiser capable of fighting independently. The compromise proved unusual. The Soviet Union developed a hybrid, the aircraft-carrying cruiser. Essentially, it was a missile cruiser equipped with a flight deck and a hangar for vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. The result was a design unlike anything else in the world. It is important to understand that the decision to create these ships was not merely an engineering whim. It was a conscious political statement. The Soviet Union was showing the world, we are not copying the Americans. We are forging our own unique path. Even in the vessel classification, the Soviet leadership insisted they be called aircraft-carrying cruisers, not aircraft carriers. This emphasized the distinction and resolved diplomatic conflicts. Under international agreements, aircraft carriers were prohibited from passing through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles straits, while cruisers could. Thus, the aircraft-carrying cruisers became not only a technical answer to the United States, but also a clever diplomatic maneuver. The Soviet Union managed to circumvent international bans while simultaneously creating a fundamentally new class of ship. The West was confused. No one understood exactly what to expect from these vessels. For Soviet sailors, however, it marked the beginning of a new era, one in which aviation and missiles were united on the same deck for the very first time. Once the idea of the aircraft-carrying cruiser received political approval, the moment came to translate it into metal. However, the path from concept to reality proved long and extremely complex. The first drafts of the designs appeared in the mid-1960s, and even then, it was clear that a ship of this type would be a true challenge for the entire Soviet shipbuilding industry. The main debate centered on what the aircraft-carrying cruiser should be. Some engineers proposed building relatively small displacement ships, capable of carrying a limited number of vertical takeoff aircraft and a small missile arsenal. Others insisted on a large hull, close to a full-fledged carrier, with extensive aviation capabilities. Ultimately, reality and economic considerations pushed toward a compromise. The final concept solidified. It had to be a heavy missile cruiser with an air group, capable of performing cover and reconnaissance missions. The design was entrusted to the Nikolaev Design Bureau, which already had experience creating large surface ships. On paper, the future giants looked impressive. A massive hull, imposing superstructures, launch systems for supersonic anti-ship missiles, and at the stern, a flight deck and hangar for aircraft. It was a true symbiosis of power. The process was rife with political maneuvering. The country's top leadership, including the Ministry of Defense and party secretaries, constantly interfered with the design, making adjustments. Some demanded increased missile armament, others wanted larger hangars. Pilots insisted on developing the aviation component, while sailors emphasized maintaining the cruiser nature of the ship. As a result, blueprints were redrawn multiple times, inevitably causing delays. A particular headache was the choice of aircraft. The Soviet Union lacked planes capable of taking off and landing on a short deck, so the focus shifted to designs from the Yakovlev Design Bureau, which was developing vertical and short takeoff aircraft. This led to the Yak-38, which later became the symbol of Soviet aircraft cruisers. The aircraft was complex, temperamental, and often limited, but there was no other option at the time. Once the final designs were approved, preparations for construction began in Nikolaev. This required colossal resources, thousands of workers, enormous workshops, and unique equipment. An atmosphere of utmost secrecy prevailed at the shipyards. Workers often didn't even know exactly which ship they were building. Information was strictly limited. Only select engineers and military specialists understood the full scale of the project. For the Soviet Union, these projects held immense symbolic importance. They demonstrated to the world that the country was not just playing catch-up with the United States, but was pursuing its own path. Even if these ships couldn't compete with American supercarriers in terms of aircraft numbers, they possessed something the Americans did not: extremely powerful missile armament. This gave them the capability to destroy an enemy carrier group with a single salvo, making the Soviet aircraft cruisers an extremely dangerous instrument of war. Thus began a new chapter in naval history. The Soviet Union was entering an era where a ship was no longer just a carrier of guns or planes. It was transforming into a universal combat platform, capable of handling tasks for multiple branches of the military. When the blueprints were approved and the political leadership gave the green light, The most spectacular and labor-intensive phase began, the laying down of the first aircraft-carrying cruisers in Nikolaev. The Nikolaev shipyards on the Black Sea coast already had a reputation as a forge of giants, where the largest ships of the Soviet fleet were built. However, the new project demanded a completely different organization of labor and unprecedented effort. The laying down of the first aircraft-carrying cruiser was an event of national significance. Leaders, military personnel, and engineers were present at the shipyard, and the workers felt they were contributing to the creation of a symbol of the future. Beneath massive cranes, amidst the clanging metal and bursts of welding sparks, a hull of astonishing size grew. Thousands of tons of steel were joined together, and before people's eyes, a ship was born that was meant to shock the entire world. The secrecy was extreme. Only vetted workers had access to the shipyard, and any information about the construction progress was carefully concealed. Photography was strictly forbidden, and discussing the project outside the facility could lead to serious trouble. Even among the workers themselves, few knew the true purpose of all the elements of the future ship. Work proceeded at a frantic pace as deadlines loomed. The country's leadership demanded strict acceleration of work, as every piece of news about the launch of another American carrier was perceived in the Soviet Union as a direct challenge. The ship's hull grew month by month, and even on the slipways, its unusual nature was evident. On one side, formidable missile systems. On the other, a long flight deck ready to receive aircraft. Simultaneously with the ship's growth, technical difficulties emerged. Firstly, the vessel was incredibly complex from an engineering standpoint. Specialists had to combine seemingly incompatible elements, powerful missile launchers, and spacious enough hangars for aircraft. Secondly, there were constant disputes over the internal layout. Sailors demanded more space for ammunition and artillery, while pilots insisted on expanding areas for aircraft maintenance. Ultimately, every compartment was the result of intense compromise. Furthermore, the Soviet Union faced the challenge of mass-building such large ships with elements of carrier architecture for the first time. This required the implementation of new technologies, the purchase of unique equipment, and a large-scale modernization of the shipyard itself. All these factors increased both the cost and the time required for the project, but backing down was not an option. The ship was becoming not only a military asset, but also a political calling card for the Soviet Union. When the hull of the first aircraft-carrying cruiser reached completion, an atmosphere of universal celebration reigned in the shipyard. Workers and engineers knew they had created something truly special. At the solemn ceremonies for the laying down and subsequent launch, speeches proclaimed that the new ship would symbolize the Soviet Union's might and provide the country with a new weapon in the struggle for control of the oceans. However, even greater trials awaited. Hull construction was only the initial phase. Now, the ship had to be filled with complex machinery, control systems, weaponry, and, crucially, prepared for its first sea trials. It was during this phase that the viability of the revolutionary hybrid idea, part carrier, part cruiser, would finally become clear. When the first Soviet aircraft-carrying cruiser left the slipways and was fully fitted out, the most critical period began: testing. This was the moment to verify whether this unique machine, combining both aviation and missiles, could actually perform combat missions. For the crews, it was a time of immense pressure and incredible pride. They were tasked with being the first to launch aircraft from the deck and fire deadly missiles on the open sea. Going to sea was always a significant event. The enormous ship, still smelling of fresh paint, slowly pulled away from the pier, escorted by dozens of tugboats into open waters. Sailors in dress uniforms stood on the deck. Aircraft were prepped in the hangars, and officers on the bridge nervously monitored every mechanism. Any malfunction could have resulted in disaster. First, the seaworthiness and handling were tested. Despite its gigantic size, the cruiser demonstrated surprising maneuverability. Its power plants ran steadily, though engineers had feared overloads. On board, the control, navigation, and electronic warfare systems were thoroughly checked. Problems were plentiful. Automation failed in some areas, leaks appeared in others, and sometimes entire mechanisms had to be rebuilt during the trials. But the main event was the flight operations of the Yak-38 aircraft. This machine had to prove that the Soviet Union was capable of creating its own naval air fist. The first vertical takeoff from the deck occurred in front of dozens of admirals, engineers, and party leaders. The aircraft, like a bird, rose vertically, hovered briefly over the deck, and roared out toward the sea. Those aboard erupted in applause. It was a historic moment. The Soviet Union officially possessed a ship capable of launching its own dedicated aircraft. However, euphoria quickly turned to anxiety. The Yak-38 proved extremely complex to operate. Its engines overheated, fuel consumption was catastrophically fast, and the aircraft itself was unpredictable upon landing. Pilots risked their lives with every flight. There were documented cases where the plane literally crashed into the sea next to the ship, requiring immediate rescue of the pilot. These incidents were a harsh reminder. The path to creating a combat-ready air wing would be long and dangerous. Moreover, the ship's very layout continued to cause controversy. The flight deck was relatively short and awkward, limiting aviation capabilities. Sailors complained that the missile launchers and aircraft interfered with each other, while engineers struggled to figure out how to make technical servicing faster and safer. All of this turned every sea voyage into a true examination. But despite all the difficulties, the trials confirmed the main point. The concept worked. The Soviet aircraft-carrying cruiser could sail the ocean, launch aircraft into the sky, and simultaneously threaten the enemy with its powerful missiles. Yes, there were many problems, and the aircraft remained temperamental, but the mere existence of such a ship made a colossal impression. For the sailors serving on these giants for the first time, these were years of romance and pride. They knew they served on a ship feared by the entire world, and they were the ones pioneering a new era for the Soviet fleet, displaying power, the peak of the cruiser era. The moment arrived when Soviet aircraft-carrying cruisers ceased to be mere experiments and began to show themselves to the world. For the Soviet Navy, this was a true triumph. The ships, recently considered a fantastic project, now proudly traversed the oceans. Their deployment to the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic became spectacular displays of force, addressed not only to allies but primarily to potential adversaries. Exercises involving the aircraft cruisers were always high-profile events. When these giants brought the Yak-38 aircraft onto the deck and launched them over the sea, the effect was stunning. Helicopters circled above the waves, practicing submarine detection. Fighter pilots trained in target interception, and crews prepared missiles for a simulated salvo against an enemy carrier group. Every such maneuver was meticulously recorded by Western reconnaissance planes and ships that invariably shadowed the Soviet squadron. The launch of the supersonic anti-ship missiles was particularly impressive. Imagine a sudden flare of fire over the calm sea as a missile hurtled skyward, capable of breaking through any defense at several times the speed of sound. For NATO, this was a nightmare. A single salvo could destroy an entire aircraft carrier, meaning the traditional order of naval warfare was collapsing before their eyes. When Soviet aircraft-carrying cruisers appeared in the Mediterranean, Western journalists and analysts grew agitated. Newspapers wrote about floating monsters, Soviet killer carriers, and a new threat to democracy. For the Soviet Union, this was the best publicity. The world saw that the country was not just catching up with the United States, but offering its own unique path for naval development. The ship's crews lived in constant tension. Every exercise was not just training, but a demonstration of strength in the face of a potential enemy. Pilots spent hours practicing takeoffs and landings. Engineers serviced the temperamental Yak-38s. Sailors prepared missiles for launch, and the command refined coordination among all ship elements. Mistakes were forbidden. Every movement was watched by the world. For the sailors themselves, serving on the aircraft-carrying cruisers was a source of special pride. They knew they were serving on ships that symbolized a new era. They were showcased in parades, featured on television, and every voyage became an event of national significance. But alongside this, a deeper understanding grew. Behind the outward strength lay internal weaknesses. The aircraft remained unreliable. The ships required colossal expenditures, and their versatility often became a burden. Yet, at that moment, no one thought about the future. The Soviet aircraft-carrying cruisers were at the peak of their glory, and the world watched their every move with trepidation. The arsenal and the paradox. To understand why Soviet aircraft-carrying cruisers caused such fear among adversaries, one must look inside their combat capabilities. These ships were true arsenals, floating fortresses that combined everything, from powerful anti-ship missiles to air defense systems and their own air wing. The main trump card was the anti-ship missiles. Aboard were massive launchers for supersonic missiles that could strike targets hundreds of kilometers away. These missiles were considered the ultimate carrier killer. Americans knew that one accurate salvo could cripple their pride, an entire carrier strike group. This is precisely why NATO regarded Soviet aircraft-carrying cruisers with such anxiety. But that was only the beginning. Each cruiser had an extremely powerful air defense system. Long, medium, and close-range missile and gun systems were hidden on the decks and in special installations, creating an impenetrable dome around the ship. This meant approaching it from the air was almost impossible. Enemy aircraft would fly into a crossfire, and their chances of breaking through to the target approached zero. Furthermore, the ships were saturated with artillery systems. Automatic anti-aircraft guns, rapid-fire mounts, and even close-in weapon systems turned every meter of space around the cruiser into a deadly zone for enemy missiles and aircraft. Anti-submarine capabilities were a particular source of pride. Helicopters equipped with sonobuoys, torpedoes, and depth charges were on board. They could patrol vast areas of the ocean, searching for enemy submarines. Thus, the aircraft-carrying cruiser became a universal weapon, capable of acting not only against surface targets, but also against invisible enemies lurking underwater. And, of course, a crucial part of this concept was the aviation component. The Yak-38 aircraft, despite all their limitations, remained an important part of the system. They provided reconnaissance, intercepted enemy targets, and covered the fleet. They operated alongside dozens of helicopters of various types: anti-submarine, search and rescue, and transport. This turned the ship into a true floating airfield, albeit in miniature compared to American carriers. In fact, the aircraft-carrying cruiser combined the functions of several ships at once. It could serve as a strike missile cruiser, an aircraft carrier, an anti-submarine hunter, and a squadron flagship. This was its main paradox. Versatility made it a formidable opponent, but simultaneously created a host of complex technical problems. For Soviet propaganda, these ships became symbols of indomitable power. They were featured in films, written about in newspapers, and participated in parades and ceremonial visits to foreign ports. The West was shocked. The world had never seen such a combination of firepower and aviation. It seemed these ships were the pinnacle of engineering, a symbol of the Soviet Union's strength and pride. But the longer they were in service, the clearer it became. Versatility came at a cost, and that cost proved too high, even for superpower. The unraveling. Economic burden and collapse. The first blow was technical complexity. The Yak-38 aircraft, intended to be the primary weapon of the air component, proved highly unreliable. Their engines frequently overheated, fuel consumption was monstrous, and their combat capabilities lagged behind even older aircraft used by adversaries. Every takeoff and landing operation became a test, not only for the pilot, but for the entire maintenance crew. Pilots often risked their lives, as a minor failure could lead to a loss of control. The ship itself also required colossal expenditure. Its complex mechanisms constantly needed repair, and systems often failed. The combination of missile launchers, aircraft hangars, anti-submarine weapons, and powerful electronics made cruiser maintenance incredibly difficult. Full operation required hundreds of specialized technicians, and any breakdown turned into a costly and lengthy problem. Internal contradictions within the fleet command worsened the situation. Sailors felt the air group was too small and incapable of serious missions. Pilots complained the deck was short and awkward, the aircraft were insufficient, and their capabilities too limited. Engineers argued over how to place weapons without hindering takeoffs and landings. As a result, the aircraft carrying cruiser became a compromise where every party felt dissatisfied. Economics also played its fatal role. Maintaining such ships was ruinously expensive. They required constant voyages for crew training, flights to maintain pilot skills, and maintenance of complex electronics. Even for the Soviet Union, with its vast resources, this became an increasingly heavy burden. When economic difficulties began in the country, the aircraft carrying cruisers became the first candidates for budget cuts. And one more issue: versatility. It was initially presented as the main advantage, one ship performing the functions of several. But in practice, versatility hindered specialization. The air wing was too weak to compete with American carriers. The missile armament was powerful, but its placement on an aircraft-carrying ship restricted aviation capabilities. Anti-submarine helicopters were useful, but their effectiveness diminished without full support from specialized forces. In the end, the aircraft-carrying cruiser was a little bit of everything but could not be the best at anything specific. Nevertheless, despite all these difficulties, the ships continued to be symbols of power. They were displayed in parades, mentioned in the news, and escorted squadrons in the Mediterranean. However, in military circles, the question was increasingly asked: was the game worth the candle? Was it worth investing massive resources in these universal giants that turned out to be too complex, expensive, and controversial? These doubts only intensified over time, especially against the backdrop of impending political and economic upheaval in the Soviet Union. The end of an era. The late 1980s became a time of immense hardship for the entire country, and the fleet was no exception. The Soviet Union fell into a deep economic crisis and soon began moving toward collapse. Against this backdrop, the gigantic aircraft-carrying cruisers, which required colossal funds for maintenance and modernization, became an unbearable burden for the state. The fate of these ships hung in the balance. Just recently, they had proudly navigated the Mediterranean, forcing NATO to nervously track their every maneuver. Now, they stood docked, rusting under snow and rain, awaiting their fate. Flight decks were empty. The Yak-38 aircraft were barely flying. Some cruisers languished in repairs that never finished. Factories received no funding. Parts delivery was sporadic, and sometimes a ship would stand idle for years, waiting for modernization that never began. Amid the devastation and lack of funds, proposals to sell these ships abroad became frequent, and such deals did materialize. Some Soviet aircraft-carrying cruisers went to foreign ports, some as scrap metal, others as prizes. Several were acquired by other countries, and their fate symbolized the decline of a once great program. Imagine, a ship that was once seen as the embodiment of Soviet power now sits in a distant dry dock, slowly being dismantled. For the sailors who served on these giants, it felt like a personal tragedy. The most painful blow was the loss of some ships without any glory. They were not sunk in battle or destroyed in a disaster. They were simply scrapped. Where once engines roared and planes took off, now the wind whistled across rusty decks, and the steps of rear guards echoed in the empty hangars. But there were those that found a second life. One ship, completed in the new political reality, was transferred to China, where it became the foundation for China's future carrier program. Another was acquired by India and served there for decades. Thus, Soviet technology, created during the Cold War, proved valuable even years later and served as the basis for the navies of other nations. For Russia, the 1990s were a time when aircraft-carrying cruisers faded into the background. The country was fighting for survival, and maintaining such giants was simply unthinkable. Crews were downsized. The ships became increasingly useless. The entire grandiose program of aircraft carrying cruisers essentially faded away before the world's eyes. This period was a tragedy for those who poured their hearts into the project: engineers, workers, and sailors. They all dreamed of a great fleet that would keep the oceans under control. But fate decided otherwise. Instead of a triumphant march across the seas, a time of oblivion and ruin arrived. The history of the Soviet aircraft carrying cruisers did not conclude with ceremonial parades or the fire of battle, but much more prosaically. The enormous ships, which once instilled fear in NATO, left active service one after another. Some were sent for scrap, others were sold abroad, where they found new life under a foreign flag. But each one left an indelible mark on world naval history. The final voyages of these giants were particularly dramatic. When an aircraft carrying cruiser sailed out to sea for the last time, the sailors felt a unique atmosphere. It seemed the ship itself understood. This was its farewell to the ocean. Aircraft still stood on the deck, helicopters launched, but everyone knew it would soon end. Photographs from those years show the last flights of the Yak-38, the last salvos of artillery, and missiles heading out to sea as a symbol of a passing era. But even in their departure, these ships carried power. They stood as a monument to engineering audacity, a symbol that the Soviet Union knew how to surprise the world and find its own way in confrontation with the West. And while their fate proved difficult, their very existence was a challenge that the United States and NATO were forced to address. The story of the Soviet aircraft carrying cruisers remains vivid and paradoxical. They were terrible weapons and simultaneously a heavy burden. They inspired sailors and frightened adversaries. They became a symbol of strength and, at the same time, a symbol of missed opportunities. It is stories like these that reveal how complex and captivating the Cold War era truly was.